Bill Maher, Thunderfoot, Richard Dawkins, Ion Hurstiali, and many other atheists as well as Christians believe that Islam is the worst and most dangerous religion because of its core beliefs, and the statistics seem to bear it out at this current moment. However, is it because of the fundamental nature of Islam and the Quran that makes Islam extremely more dangerous than Christianity or any of the other major religions? Well, let's see. Both holy books talk about vanquishing their enemies, both talk about killing non-believers, and both are for enforcing very strict regulations and harsh penalties for breaking them. An argument can even be made that without the little blip in the Gospels, from a humanist standpoint, the Bible is worse than the Quran, but only slightly. Check out my video on Religion Off if you disagree. I'm going to have to say it's not the books. There is something much more to it. Colonialism is a word we use in the past, but tend to blame the latest colonists for the problems, which I kind of do. However, empires and colonies were pretty much the way everyone did things prior to the post-World War II era. If you weren't an empire, you were fair game to be exploited, and you probably didn't have the network needed to build a self-defense army due to the lack of trade and resources. You were always fighting over resources, or you could be at a disadvantage from another empire. Only the strong survived, and all empires did truly horrific things to keep themselves at the top. The Muslim Caliphate and the Holy Roman Empire were both colonial empires based on religion. They waned and waxed in their own right like any. Wealthy lords, emperors, and kings as ruling classes above the masses used the churches and other propaganda to cause hatred and division between their neighbors as these ruling elites played human chess games with each other. Prior to World War I, the Ottoman Empire was a very powerful influence for many generations. At the time, there were nearly 100,000 people in the Ottoman Empire that were of the Sufi sect, which was a very mystical and near-Buddhist, peace-loving inner contemplation sect of it. Secularism was on even footing with Europe at the time, though literacy was much lower. Many Muslims immigrated to America and around the world at the founding of America, and were referenced by many founding fathers at the time. Islam was no more or less evil or dangerous than Christianity. So what happened? Well, the Ottomans lost the war. First off, Arabia, which was loosely controlled by the Ottomans, rebelled, and allied with the British, turning the tide and weakening the Ottoman Empire. In an Arab uprising, Ibn Saud, a radical Wahhabist, took power and declared himself king of Arabia, even naming the nation after himself, Saudi Arabia. Even the Kims didn't have that level of arrogance in North Korea. When they lost, Britain decided to segment up the empire to smaller governments. However, they didn't do it based on any form of ethnic ties. What they did is they divided it up specifically to keep them from forming a nationalist identity easily, and then put minority religious regimes in power to keep the majority from rising up and becoming a problem. This was very strategic for the time in imperial thinking, but it could be argued that France and Britain did far worse to the German Weimar Republic than they did to these new nations. Lastly, as the Britons, being very anti-Semitic at the time, now had control over Palestine, the traditional homeland of the Jewish diaspora, what a great way to get them out of Britain in the West. And now a huge migration of Jews moved into the Levant. There had always been a tiny population of Jews, and prior to the war, the Jews began the process of buying up land from the Ottoman Empire in Palestine to create a homeland. They ended up paying for 29% of the current nation of Israel, and the Palestinians were for the most part pretty welcoming or neutral to the new immigrants because they were used to living in a semi-secular empire. However, a strong anti-Semitic group backed by wealthy donors, one of the most notable being Henry Ford, began mass printing and circulating the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a tract full of conspiracy that the Jews were trying to take over the world. The Palestinians and their Muslim neighbors, being fairly uneducated on average, who had little knowledge of their new neighbors, began freaking out, leading to several wars that ended up leaving Israel in the predicament and size it is today, creating a stalemate over Jerusalem, a holy city for both Jews and Muslims. Then Gandhi's revolution occurred and decolonization began. Britain divided up the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, possibly rushing the border declarations to stay out of a civil war, causing sectarian war and anger. So the Muslim world is in a world of hurt, an advanced semi-secular power dismantled, and revolutions began to occur to overthrow some of the kings and corrupt rulers the Brits had put in place. Now enter America. After World War II, there were two standing superpowers after most of the other powers had decimated each other. The Soviets got nukes in the 50s and the Cold War started. When Israel declared statehood because of a growing pro-Zionistic evangelical group, encouraged to be anti-secular because of the evil atheist commies, the US was the first to recognize it so it wouldn't be allied with the USSR, as there were many socialist and communist Jews in Israel. America was scared to death about the rise of communism from Korea and Vietnam, and Soviet-friendly, secular, democratically elected regions arose from Libya to Afghanistan. Pretty much all of the decisions made post-World War II were in light of fresh memories of the horrors of the dictatorship Hitler caused. Over that time period, the US began funding groups who were anti-regime, and just so happened to also be religiously radical and anti-secular. Saudi Arabia had massive oil reserves discovered, so the US and UK played very nice with them, and they became our allies. The Eisenhower administration helped overthrow the democratically elected, though not so secular president of Iran, who wanted their oil to be for the Iranian people, and replaced him with a monarchic Shah. And when they overthrew him, they replaced him with a radical Shia cleric and an acting theocracy. In the 80s, the Thatcher administration supported Saddam Hussein, and the Reagan administration supported the Taliban, training them and helping them overthrow their democratic secular governments. America supported many proxy wars against Russia because we wanted to cut them off of resources and influence, because we believed that dictatorial communism was such a horrible cancer on the world, and freedom, that radical extremists with totalitarian dictators were so much better. After the Berlin Wall and the rest of the Soviet Union fell, things got weird. We no longer had a big bad enemy, and our allies started looking really brutal and just plain bad people. So we started pushing the idea of democracy on them, and as they were used to getting unfettered support from us to fight, and using terrorism tactics we had trained them to use on Soviets, it didn't go so well. With extremely damaged infrastructures from years of war and government oppression, education was low, and corruption and graft were incredibly high. When we invaded Afghanistan, we tried to train them to be soldiers, and most couldn't read or even write their own name, or do the math to find out if their commander had skimmed money off their paychecks. These skills are now being taught to Afghan troops after 10 years, but changing tactics took forever. Being so isolated and poorly educated, conspiracy theories abound in much of the poor Islamic world. Some Taliban fighters believe there is a global conspiracy by Christians, Jews, and Hindus to wipe out Islam, and that the necktie is actually a Christian symbol. Also, some Palestinians believe that the matzah on Passover was made with the blood of Palestinian babies. On top of this, when the US invaded Iraq, the Bush administration fired anyone in the military who had Ba'ath Party ties, which was anyone in the military, and 50% of the people in the nation were militarily employed, so our invasion caused immediate 50% unemployment spike. Pride of taking care of your family is very important in this area, and with a wrecked economy, the temptation of Al-Qaeda promising to take care of your family with Saudi oil money looked more and more tempting. Of course, the majority of what happened was just like how Muslims were ignorant of Jews when they immigrated to Palestine, Americans were largely ignorant of Muslims when 9/11 occurred, and now just have a purely negative opinion of them as people.